Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. I have three tales before me. One of them is definitely a ghost story. The other two are sort of ghost stories. You'll see what I mean. But all three involve people who have an encounter with someone that they recognize, someone who's dear to them, and they soon find out that that person is dead. Or they knew all along that that person is dead. The first one comes from an anonymous article titled Four Stories. It was published in All the Year Round in 1861. Some people will argue that it's not a ghost story, it's much more a clairvoyance story or a dream presentiment kind of story. But the word ghost is used. Now, give it a listen and tell me what you think. Overhanging the waters of the Firth of Forth, there lived a good many years ago a family of old standing in the kingdom of Fife, frank, hospitable, and hereditary Jacobites. It consisted of the squire or laird, a man well advanced in years, his wife, 3 sons, and 4 daughters. The sons were sent out into the world, but not into the service of the reigning family. The daughters were all young and unmarried, and the eldest and the youngest were much attached to each other. They slept in the same room, shared the same bed, and had no secrets from one another. It chanced that among the visitors to the old house there came a young naval officer, whose gun brig often put into the neighboring harbors. He was well received, and between him and the elder of the 2 sisters a tender attachment sprang up. But the prospect of such an alliance did not quite please the lady's mother, and without being absolutely told that it should never take place, the lovers were advised to separate. The plea urged was that they could not then afford to marry, and that they must wait for better times. Those were times when parental authority, at all events in Scotland, was like the decree of fate, and the lady felt that she had nothing left to do but to say farewell to her lover. Not so he. He was a fine gallant fellow, and taking the old lady at her word, he determined to do his utmost to push his worldly fortunes. There was war at that time with some northern power, I think with Prussia, and the lover, who had interest in the Admiralty, applied to be sent to the Baltic. He obtained his wish. Nobody interfered to prevent the young people from taking a tender farewell of each other, and he, full of hope, and she, desponding, they parted. It was settled that he should write by every opportunity, and twice a week. On the post days at the neighboring village, the younger sister would mount her pony and ride in for the letters. There was much hidden joy over every letter that arrived, and then intense anxiety until the next arrived. And often the sisters would sit at the window a whole winter's night, listening to the roar of the sea among the rocks, and hoping and praying that each light, as it shone far away, might be the signal lamp hung at the masthead to apprise them that the gun brig was coming. So the weeks stole on in hope deferred, and there came a lull in the correspondence. Post day after post day brought no letters from the Baltic, and the agony of the sisters, especially the betrothed, became almost unbearable. They slept, as I have said, in the same room, and their window looked down well nigh into the waters of the Firth. One night the younger sister was awakened by the heavy moanings of the elder. They had taken to burning a candle in their room and placing it in the window, thinking, poor girls, that it would serve as a beacon to the brig. She saw by its light that her sister was tossing about and was greatly disturbed in her sleep. After some hesitation, she determined to waken the sleeper, who sprang up with a wild cry, and pushing back her long hair with her hands, exclaimed, "What have you done? What have you done?" Her sister tried to soothe her, and asked tenderly if anything had alarmed her. "Alarmed?" she answered, still very wildly. "No, but I saw him. He entered at the door and came near the foot of the bed. He looked very pale, and his hair was wet. He was just going to speak to me when you drove him away. Oh, what have you done? What have you done?" I do not believe that her lover's ghost really appeared, but the fact is certain that the next mail from the Baltic brought the intelligence that the gun brig had gone down in a gale of wind with all on board. Okay, not really a ghost story, and you had to put up with me trying to sound like a woman, so let me give you the actual ghost story. This comes from a book titled Hierologus, or The Church Tourist. It was published in 1843 and written by John Mason Neal. Now, Neal talks a little bit about something that I discussed in the previous episode of Tales Told, the purposeful ghost, meaning one that comes back to reveal a murderer or perhaps have its bones dug up and reinterred in a more ceremonious fashion, versus the purposeless ghost, which seems to come back for no clear reason at all. One argument against ghosts is the uselessness of most of the visitations of which we read. But who and what are we that we should presume to judge as to what is useful and what not of things supernatural? One story let me tell you to the point. I will vouch for the truth of the tale so far as I can for that of anything at which I was not present myself. A gentleman was returning to his house in Evesham in Worcestershire one evening in the late twilight. When a short distance from the town, he saw on the opposite side of the road a friend whom he knew well to have been for some years dead. Excessively terrified, he quickened his pace. The figure did the same. He walked slowly. The apparition followed his example. So the pair kept on until they were almost in the town, when the gentleman in question saw two ill-looking fellows crouching down at the side of a hedge, and heard one of them say to the other, "It won't do, Tom. There are two of them." Shortly after passing these men, the apparition vanished. Sometime subsequently, it was discovered that the two men had formed a design of robbing on that particular evening the gentleman whom I have mentioned, and were only restrained from doing so by the belief that he was accompanied by a friend. Now, here is a case where, if the explanation had not been afforded, the visitation would certainly have been regarded as most useless. As it is, who can tell how often is real, though not so clear, a benefit results from such agency? The next story comes from an article titled Notes on Ghosts and Goblins. It was published in Cornhill Magazine in 1873. It's written by Richard Proctor, though he was anonymous in this particular publication of it, but I found his name in a later reprint of the same thing. Proctor makes it clear as he tells his story that what he's perceiving does not fit with our usual definition of ghost, but he does raise the question of, well, what do we mean by ghost? My mother died during the long vacation of my first year at Cambridge. It chanced that I was in Germany at the time, and I suffered much distress of mind from the thought that I had been enjoying a pleasure tour during the days of her last illness. Letters had followed me from place to place, but it was only the circumstance of my staying my journey one Sunday at Heidelberg which enabled me to receive news from England, and I only reached home in time to attend her funeral. Yet the full effect of these circumstances was only experienced when I found myself again settled in my rooms at Cambridge. There is a singular mixture of society and solitude in university life, which at times of trouble produces unpleasant feelings. Throughout the day there is abundant opportunity for intercourse with friends. Although amongst one's college friends are some who will be friends for life, yet at the same time the interchange of ideas, even with these special friends, relates almost wholly to college work or college interests. There is nothing home-like in social arrangements at college. So soon as the oak is sported for the evening, a lonely feeling is apt to come on, which affects even some of those who have no recent sorrows to brood over. There is a refuge in hard reading, but hard reading in my case had come to an end on my mother's death. I had so far accustomed myself to associate college successes with the idea of pleasure given to her that I now looked with aversion on my former studies. They could no longer gain the prize I had alone cared for. I ought, no doubt, to have quite other feelings, but I speak of the effects I actually experienced. Now, whether the breaking up of my old plans for work had upset me, or in whatever way it happened, I certainly had never found college life so lonely and unpleasant as during the first term of my second year, and it seems to me likely that the low spirits from which I then suffered may have had something to do with the singular instance of self-deception I have now to relate. I had on one evening been particularly, I may say unreasonably, low-spirited. I sat brooding for hours over dismal thoughts. These thoughts had followed me to bed, and I went to sleep still under their influence. I cannot remember my dreams. I did dream, and my dreams were melancholy, but although I had a perfectly clear remembrance of their tenor on first waking, they had passed altogether from my recollection the next morning. It is to be noted, however, that I was under the influence of sorrowful dreams when I woke. At this time the light of a waning moon was shining into the room. I opened my eyes and saw, without surprise or any conscious feeling of fear, my mother standing at the foot of the bed. She was not in her habit as she lived, but clothed in white samite, mystic, wonderful. Her face was pale, though not with the pallor of life, her expression sorrowful, and tears which glistened in the moonlight stood in her eyes. And now a strange mental condition followed. My reason told me that I was deceived by appearances, that the figure I saw was neither my mother's spirit nor an unreal vision. I felt certain that I was not looking at a phantom of the brain which would show itself without. I felt equally certain that no really existent spirit was there before me. Yet the longer I looked, the more perfect appeared the picture. I racked my memory to recall any objects in my room which could be mistaken for a shrouded ghost, but my memory was busy recalling the features of the dead, and my brain, against the action of my will, was tracing these features in the figure which stood before me. The deception grew more and more complete, until I could have spoken aloud as to a living person. Meantime, my mind had suggested and at once rejected the idea of a trick played on me by one of my college friends. I felt a perfect assurance that, whatever it was which stood before me, it was not a breathing creature self-restrained into absolute stillness. How long I remained gazing at the figure I cannot remember, but I know that I continued steadfastly looking at it until I had assured myself that, to my mind, in its probably unhealthy condition, the picture was perfect in all respects. At last I raised my head from the pillow, intending to draw nearer to the mysterious figure, but it was quite unnecessary. I had not raised my head 3 inches before the ghost was gone, and in its place, or rather, not in its place, but 5 or 6 feet farther away, hung my college surplice. It was quite impossible to restore the illusion by resuming my former position. The mind which, a moment before, had been so completely deceived, rejected completely even the idea of resemblance. There was nothing even in the arrangement of the folds of the surplice to justify in the slightest degree an illusion which nevertheless had been perfect while it lasted. Only one feature of the apparition was so far accounted for. I have said that the eyes shone with tears. The explanation was rather commonplace. Over my surplice I had hung a rowing belt, and the silvered buckles, partly concealed by the folds of the surplice, shone in the moonlight. A little reminder from Richard Proctor that sometimes ghosts aren't really ghosts. Sometimes we see what we want to see, or perhaps even what we need to see. As I was collecting these 25 ghost stories, all of them purportedly true and all of them published during the Victorian period, I didn't want to leave out the ones like this last one, the ones where the ghost is not a ghost, but it's much more a misperception, because those were part of the stories that the Victorians told about ghosts. Not everyone believed in ghosts. I don't think there's ever been a point in human history when everybody agreed on ghosts. I don't think there's a point in human history when everyone agreed on anything. That said, the vast majority of what I collected are stories that feature what I think most people would say is some kind of ghost. Maybe we don't trust the story being told about the ghost, but the ghost in the story does feel, at least, like a ghost, a genuine ghost. If you'd like to find out more about these 25 stories, please visit a website. It's ghostlyhearthside, all one word, .wordpress, one word, .com. It's a little side project I've been working on just because I'm fascinated by the history of ghosts, and I really like the idea of people getting together around a fire, probably during winter, maybe during Christmas, and sharing ghost stories. I did this with a group of friends of mine, and we read some of these stories, but for the most part, we talked about our own experiences. And it was very, very interesting and a lot of fun. We sipped mulled wine and we had baked goods. It was a great time. I talk about all of that on the website, ghostlyhearthside.wordpress.com. I'm Tim Prossel, and thank you very much for listening.